Right, we come to our last but by no means least speaker of the day. David Scrimgeour is a Scot who, having had enough of IT, jumped over Hadrian's Wall and went to live in Yorkshire, where he's lived for quite a long time. And he became interested in the West Yorkshire archives for the local asylum while he was studying for a degree with Strathclyde. He's also been very involved with the Goole Waterways Museum until recently, when financial problems mean that its future looks a bit uncertain, and is indeed talking on a different subject connected with the waterways at our next seminar in Selby. If any of you feel like buying up a museum and all its heritage, please talk to David. Whatever that. He is also a member of the Guild. So again, he's amongst friends. So please welcome David to talk to us about perhaps one of the most dreaded places after the workhouse, the asylum.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And it's good to see you're all still smiling after. I will try and keep that tone. Sue has actually just touched on the answer to the question, how on earth did I get involved in studying asylum, and a particular asylum? And the answer was homework, because I did study for a postgraduate diploma with the University of Strathclyde, and it was in, let me get this right, genealogy, paleography and heraldic studies, which is family history with knobs on. So it's a 2-year course, and in the second year they set us a piece of homework which was called a building study. And the idea was to pick yourself a building and research what primary sources were available for anybody who wanted to know about the building, the people who lived there, the people who worked there. So first of all, you've got to pick a building, and I thought, well, there's one I pass quite frequently, and that's the one I chose. It was latterly known as Stanley Royd Hospital in Wakefield, but what that name hides is that the actual institution had been in existence since 1818. Sorry, wrong way, look at that. When it was actually known as the West Riding Pauper Lunatic Asylum. Now that's actually an engraving that was done by a chap called Landseer. And I'm told that he does a very fine line in lions as well. But if I could just, this laser pointer here. Can you see these strange shapes here? They call them cupola. And if we just go back, you can see the cupola still there. Now that building still exists, because when the asylum closed, like a lot of asylums in the country, rather than just being simply demolished, it was rebuilt, if you like, or reused for private accommodation. So it's full of private houses now. So I wonder who's got the padded cell. That's that bit. But yeah, I was a bit staggered to learn that it had been around since 1818. But I went to do the usual. The meat and drink to us is the things like the census. And that's where I learned that after 1841, they started implementing, if you like, some sort of data protection for their patients, because the 51, 61, 71, 81, 91 censuses list the patient's initials only, which makes it a little bit of a challenge. Ancestry cannot cope with, with just initials. But what I was staggered to discover was that in the local records office, the West Yorkshire Archive Service, I think we've got a picture here, yeah, that was the building I spent an awful lot of time in. It also houses the Register of Deeds for the West Riding of Yorkshire. But it closed a couple of years ago, and they moved everything to a brand new complex. It was just as well, really, because they were suffering from hot and cold running pigeons and all sorts of things that archives should not mix with. But if you look at the new building, it looks a bit like a ship, doesn't it? But the West Yorkshire History Centre in Wakefield now is the home for the record set that I spent my time examining. So I'd not really spent a lot of time in archives, but I thought, well, I've got to go and look at what they've got. And I discovered that they have got a practically complete set of patients' case notes dating back to 1818. In fact, the whole collection has won a UNESCO award for it because it's been recognized as being of national, if not international, importance. So I thought, I've got to look at one of these case books. And when you do, you make your request, then they bring it out, and it's sort of brown, and the cover it's sort of crumbly. You do not want to wear a white shirt when you're dealing with these case books. But you turn the pages, and suddenly you're looking at material that was written 200 years ago. Now that kind of sent a little shiver down my neck. It was a bit special, but it's when you actually read the material that you learn why it's so special. If we've got, let me just, yeah, that is the first case note entry in the first case book. It's the only one in the collection that has male and female patients. But the first chap in the case book is Thomas Arundel. Now, Thomas wasn't the first patient admitted to the asylum, but he was one of the first. And his case notes will tell us stuff about Thomas that it's meat and drink to family historians. He'd been admitted because he was suffering from depression, and it was said to have been caused, his depression had been caused by his erroneous views on religion. It had been affecting him for about 12 months. But it then goes on to describe him as being of medium build, with a pale complexion and light hair. Fantastic. That's great. But it doesn't stop there, because the case notes then go on to tell us about what life was like for him in the asylum, about what happened to him. And that's an example. He was a trusted individual. But his case note straight away tells us that he went through the kitchen one day, picked up a carving knife, and decided to take a finger off because he was uncertain that he had any blood in him. Now, I think we all know the answer. But I thought that is wonderful. Yeah, I wouldn't expect to see that in modern hospital records. But it's a commentary about what life was like, and particularly for Thomas. But the good news is that he did lose the top of his finger, but he had no sinister effects as a result of that. But I thought that's wonderful, wonderful stuff. But the catch is that, of course, I was there to just check out the records. I couldn't really spend much time. Submitted my homework and passed, I'm pleased to say. The other thing that happened to me is that when I was doing my own family history, I discovered that my great-grandmother, Lizzie Scrimgeour, had died of the flu in 1919. She was a late victim of the global pandemic that killed more people than the Great War. I got her death certificate, and there it was. She'd been taken to Gartloch Asylum, and I thought special place for, for flu victims, like a sanatorium. But I know, or I knew because I'd visited as part of my course, that the NHS records for Strathclyde are held by the University of Glasgow Archives. So I thought, I'll see what they can tell me. So I wrote to Glasgow University Archives, and a few weeks later they came back. There's their lovely letter telling me about Lizzie Scrimgeour. I wasn't expecting that. Okay, and that's when I discovered that Gartloch was in fact a mental hospital. At the age of 36, my great granny had a stillbirth. That tipped her into serious depression. She was in and out of asylums for the next 15 years of her life. She was in a bad way. But that itself is very interesting. But what was even more interesting, her case notes in here 3 pictures of my great-grandmother. The only 3 pictures I've got. And I think you can tell, looking at that one, that she's looking pretty ill. I much prefer this one, which was taken the year before her demise. But all of a sudden I was learning stuff about my great-grandmother that I didn't know. Because their case notes talk about relatives. They talk about her husband, Richard. They talk about her children. They talk about her background, where she lived. All stuff that, yes, you can find. But I'll tell you what, there's not many places you could go and find a picture of your great-grandmother. So what I'll say is, if you actually do find an ancestor that was a lunatic, that was the word that was being used historically, celebrate, because there is every chance that there could be some records available that'll tell you stuff that you wouldn't be able to find in any other record set. So that's really my message today. Celebrate if you've got any ancestors. Anne, where are you? My friend from last night, I did suggest to you that you didn't have any ancestors that were lunatics, did you? How many have you found now? 2 for certain. Celebrate! The list you showed me, I'm pretty sure they were. But so my mission today is to give you the flavor of the sort of fantastic material you can find in asylum records, and encourage you to go and search. In doing that, we're also going to learn a bit about what life was like for patients. We're only going to be able to scratch the surface in the time we have available. But we'll give it a go and see how we get on. So, I didn't finish the story, did I? Because an opportunity came up for me to give up the day job. And I was able to take a sabbatical from work, because I used to sell IT for IBM. And I thought, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to write a book. So I went back to the archives, because this time I was wanting to do some proper studying, and I thought, I'm going to write a book about how to how to research these archives. And as part of that, I'll put in some case studies to show people what great material you can find. It took me a little while, but the penny then dropped that I might be the only person who ever read it. But the case notes themselves were very powerful stories, very, very powerful. So what I did, I actually decided on, there's about 150 plus case studies that I've looked into, and I've put them all together in my book, which was published at the beginning of 2016, and it's called Proper People: Early Asylum Life in the Words of Those Who Were There. Because that's what I'm doing. I'm actually using, and I will be this afternoon, using what was written at the time. So that's what we're going to do. So, Proper People, by the way, I discovered that when people were being committed to the asylum, the early paperwork that was being used, the doctor would sign off, the magistrate would then countersign to say that so-and-so was a proper object to be admitted to the asylum. Now we're talking early 19th century here. But it was probably about 30 years before they finally came round to referring to them as a proper person. And I decided, well, I'm going to mark that by calling my book Proper People, because these were real people. They were suffering from an illness that could affect any of us. So that's why it's called that. And yes, it is available here today. Right, let's crack on then. Why were these individuals in the asylum? They were poor. They couldn't work. Their illness had basically said they couldn't go out to work with their illness, and they no longer could be looked after in the workhouse or at home. And it's absolutely correct. The gentleman who spoke earlier this morning, the workhouses did provide accommodation for pauper lunatics. They would have a lot of them would have a proper lunatic ward. And in fact, I found instances where workhouses are also equipped with a padded cell. Okay, so they were actually looking after people with mental health issues. A lot of people were looked after at home. It wasn't a question of if somebody was unwell, they'd straight away be placed in the workhouse, or a lot of them would be looked after at home. But the thing that seemed to tip the balance was if they showed any sign of being a danger to themselves or to others, that would be sufficient reason for them to be moved from the care in the workhouse to the, shall we say, the specialist care available in the asylum. So it was about violence. So yes, you would find a lot of people who might have tried to kill themselves. They would find their way into the asylum. Poor law authorities, they were paying the bill. And in the early days, the cost of keeping somebody in the asylum was approximately 5-6 shillings. And that was met by initially the parish, but later the poor law unions. The individuals, as I touched on earlier, they were committed to the asylum in a similar sort of way to what happens today. We have, I think it's called sectioning. So it's a combination of the medical authorities and the legal authorities that are saying that somebody needs to go into care. That was what happened back at from when the asylum opened in 1818. When we look at, here we go. This gentleman, Joseph Baxter, he was admitted to the asylum, and what his case notes actually tell us is the sort of the attitude of the magistrate who was committing him to the asylum, because he had been in the workhouse, he had been admitted to the workhouse, but he did not want to work in the workhouse. So the magistrate on the paperwork, he's asked what remedies have been used for this individual, and he answered the wrong question, because he answered the question, what remedies do you think should be used? And his attitude was, I think you should use a whip on him, because he's just refused to work since he's been in the workhouse. So you detect some it's an attitude to mental illness that we wouldn't approve of today. But that was Joseph Baxter. The other thing that we find with people being committed to the asylum is, we touched on Thomas Arundel and why he was there for erroneous views on religion. But you've got other reasons for people being admitted, and this is all recorded on their paperwork. John Stonehouse from Leeds, he was a young man, a 23-year-old clockmaker from Leeds, and he had been, the reason for his insanity was debauchery and drunkenness. So nothing very fancy in there. But in his case notes, it goes on to say that, he had scarcely been sober during the last 5 years. So, wow, if you had John Stonehouse in your ancestry, that would be wonderful stuff. What have we got here? Oh, George Penny from Bradford. He's one of the characters. He's one of my favourite characters. He was admitted, a 25-year-old bachelor, and he was admitted in 1826. He was a very good tailor. And his illness, his depression, had been caused by disappointment in love. None of us in this room could have escaped that one. But again, George's earliest case notes give you no indication that he would spend the next 49 years of his life in the asylum. Now, David Preston from Gummersall, the reason for him being committed was loss of property. But I'd just like to share with you a paragraph from his case notes. This is 12th of January 1838. No better in mind. A few days since, imagined his sister in one of the drains in the field, and went and called her to come out. He now fancies her in the wine cellar. Yeah, they had a wine cellar. He now fancies her in the wine cellar and begs she may have a corkscrew and a loaf of bread sent to her. Now, I actually think there's a lot of logic behind that. But again, that's the kind of colourful material that you will find in the records. Anne Clapham from Guiseley, she was a young woman, an 18-year-old newlywed. And this was 1829, she was admitted. She'd married her husband Joseph only a fortnight earlier. And the question on the paperwork says, can any reason be assigned for the first attack of the disease? And the answer was, no reason, except that the husband says she complained the day after her marriage, and the next night in bed, she tore his shirt and wanted to bite his nose off. Maybe she just got carried away. But as a result of that, she had been bled, purged, and had her head shaved. Anyway, we've talked about Joseph Baxter. So, who were the kinds of people who were being committed to the asylum? Yes, there was no question there were people who were, by today's standards, mentally ill. And I'm no doctor, but I've sought advice, and you can see descriptions that tie in with things like bipolar behavior. Somebody being manic one moment and then depressed the next. So you can actually read into the case notes. But I've tended not to do too much of that. But you would find in the asylum people who'd been in jail, who'd actually become mentally ill while they were in prison. Or you might find individuals who'd been tried and found to have been not guilty through reason of insanity. So there was a mix of people. Yes, there were lots of elderly people, because we're talking about the first half of the 19th century. Dementia, mental illness. So yes, lots of elderly people. Those with learning difficulties. There were lots of alcoholics in the asylum. And epilepsy was, again, there were no clever drugs to treat people. So epileptics would find their way into the asylum, where the treatment they would get, they would be supervised, if you like. There would be extra folk watching for them during the night, and there's some special pillows that help them prevent them from suffocating should they have a fit. But there were no clever drugs, so it was a major problem. Yes, there were lots of women who were suffering from both pre- and postnatal depression. There's one young lady who, Rose Clark, from High Bentham, near Kirby Lonsdale, which is about as far north in the West Riding as you can go. And she had been, she'd been bled, blistered, and purged ahead of admission. But that wasn't a great thing for somebody who was thought to be 7 months pregnant. So she's admitted to the asylum, and it took a little bit longer than planned, but in September 1826, has been delivered of a fine male child, is doing very well and is perfectly sane. She had her baby in the asylum. And she was discharged, went home, and sadly the little boy didn't really make it through the winter. But that's the first birth I found in the asylum. I do not want you to think that the asylum was a place where people were admitted to and the key was then thrown away. That was certainly not the way it happened, because the asylum was being paid for out of the county rates, out of the West Riding of Yorkshire rates. So they didn't want to keep people in the asylum if they could send them home, and send them home to hopefully return to work and earn the keep for their families. So there was very much the whole ethos was about recovery. And what people who read my book actually say, that it comes across in the case notes that The doctors are very compassionate towards the patients. So there was no suggestion it was, you know, they're in here and they'll be here until they die. Also, because the asylum was funded out of the rates, if an individual suddenly was no longer a pauper, then they couldn't stay. And it didn't really matter about their state of health. They would actually be discharged. And I came across one example of a chap called Thomas Poynton. He was from Wakefield, and he was removed. He was actually discharged in the morning and taken to York Asylum the same day. Now, York Asylum was taking private patients, so he was going to have to pay. And that puzzled me a little bit, but I'll come back to that in a moment. But I have to share with you, again, another extract from his case notes. Because when he had been admitted in 1842, they thought that he had tried to kill himself. He was suicidal. But that was not the case. Because the case note on 22nd of January 1842, I should have put a squeamish warning out, shouldn't I? Anyway, the case note from 1842 says, "The testicles have been severed at the neck of the scrotum by a clean incision with a razor, and the wound is healing favorably. He says the wound gave him severe pain at the time it was inflicted, but he has suffered very little from it since. His account of the deed is that he could not control his passions, but lusted after every woman he saw, and as the enemy had got the upper hand of him, he determined to put a stop to his desires and make himself a eunuch. He sleeps badly at night, but is tolerably quiet." Anyway, I digressed there, didn't I? When he died, he passed away in 1870, and because I like to just check out all the loose ends, I discovered he was mentioned in what do you call them when you got the wills and the letters of administration? Probate, thank you. And it turned out that the letters of administration had been granted to his aunt, valuing his estate between £2,500 and £3,000, which in 1870 was a significant amount of money. And I'm guessing that he had inherited, because he'd been declared a pauper when he first went into the West Riding Asylum, but he'd inherited, and that's why they moved him to York. Removed to another asylum, or in this case, I want to tell a little story about a girl. She's a teenager. And again, this harks back to the first presentation this morning, when we were talking about the food in the workhouse and what life was like. Eliza Wright, she was from Bradford Moor, 19 years old, a millwright, and she'd been admitted from the workhouse, suffering from melancholia and in a reduced state. She was confined to bed, so not working, because again in the asylum, able-bodied individuals were encouraged to work, often at the trade that they'd followed before they were admitted to the asylum. But if they weren't able-bodied, they were excused, and she was lying in bed. She's a teenager, isn't she? But her medication, right? Her medication included half a pint of strong beer and a glass of wine daily, right? And it's clear that she was also enjoying her food, because it says here, this is February 1847, continues in bed, listless and always complaining, eats pretty well and has many indulgences in diet. Says she often vomits after dinner. Yeah. But the 28th of April 1847 lies constantly in bed and complains of being weak and poorly and unable to sit up, but she has no perceptible ailment. I got this picture in my head of, oh, doctor, no, I'm not well. But she eats well, grows stouter, and her pulse is natural. What I should say is that the workhouse food was deliberately kept at a level below what might be expected at home. So it was deliberately poor food. The asylum was the opposite, because they recognized that many of the patients needed building up. So that the diet, the dietary as they call it, was a much better combination of food, and she was clearly enjoying it. She eats well, grows stouter, and her pulse is natural. She appears invariably in the same posture when I see her. It is evidently an assumed one on hearing anyone approach her room to excite commiseration. When not aware that she is observed, she talks and laughs with some of the other patients and occasionally spends her time in looking out of her room window, to do which she has to stand upon the bed. She exhibits no aberration of mind and would be more appropriately placed in a workhouse than in an asylum. The wool was not pulled over the physician's eyes. And literally a few days later, she was sent back to the workhouse. Right. Patients did die in the asylum. A lot of the patients were old and infirm. A lot of them were terminally ill. I've been doing a piece of work that suggests that roughly, of the people leaving the asylum, roughly 40% die, pass away. There was one particular episode in 1849 when Elizabeth Fenton was admitted from Gummersall Workhouse. And she was sent into the asylum, and nobody had actually informed the physician at the asylum that just 2 days earlier, 2 patients in the workhouse had died from cholera. Now, cholera back in those days, in 1849, I can only imagine it was a bit like saying we've got Ebola. They were worried, they were feared it. Cholera was feared. And rightly so, because over the course of the next 3 months, over 100 patients in the asylum lost their lives as a result of cholera. That was the single biggest loss of life that I found in the records. Strangely, Elizabeth wasn't one of them. She actually recovered. But I think it was a couple of years later, she did pass away as a result of diarrhea. We also get a lot of patients who escape from this high security prison, did I say prison? Asylum. From the day it was built, I can only say that the airing court walls were never high enough. The airing court where folk went out for exercise. So the records do have many instances of people actually escaping over the airing court walls. John Field, for example, from Rothwell, 1820. Now this is a chap, he was a butcher, 35 years old. And he was one of those folk who was always complaining about something. And his case notes just follow this through. So, June 1819, complains of debility. December, complains of pain at his stomach, which he thinks will be cured by tincture of rhubarb. Now, the asylum was actually built in what we call today the rhubarb triangle. So rhubarb was very popular. April the following year, urine high-coloured, complains of pain in his back. Anyway, that November, the case notes tell us that he decided to take a short break. 10th of November, escaped over the airing court wall last night about 6 o'clock. He returned of his own accord about 5 o'clock this morning. So where had he been? The clue, I think, is in the following day. It says, has not been well since his return. Complains of sickness, tongue white. Now, I might be wrong here, but I think he'd gone back to his local hostelry. And you can imagine his wife didn't want anything to do with him when he came home, which is why he had to go back to the asylum the next morning. So yes, people did escape. Mary Emmett. She was 37 years old from Addingham. I couldn't quite believe what I was reading here. So she was trusted. She was a trusted individual. 1825. She has been employed as an assistant in the house for some time past, and on the 28th of March last, she effected her escape over the wall by means of a ladder and got and got home but was brought back immediately. Who's left a ladder lying around? Right, now then, we've got another chap here, Thomas Lawton. So we're still talking about escapes. Now he'd been admitted in 1859, suffering from melancholia. And May the following year, he escaped, okay? And he wasn't found, he wasn't retaken, as they say. If he was found and captured, if you like, within 14 days, they could take him back to the asylum without going back through the legal, medical examination, all that sort of stuff. But as long as if he was out for more than that period of time, then it wasn't the asylum's business anymore. It was down to the Poor Law Union. Anyway, he was readmitted in 1862, having been out since he escaped. But can you believe what must have been said 9 months later, 1862? This patient escaped on November the 5th and has been heard of since, having changed his clothes at his brother's house at Emley and gone off, no one knows where. So he wasn't recaptured, so he was a free man. But what I didn't expect was to find that we can actually see what was going through his mind, because he wrote to the asylum superintendent to thank him. And his penciled letter is there in the case notes. So this is a rare instance where you've actually got an insight from the patient himself, rather than it being third party, the physicians. And he's saying, liberty is sweet in the land. Now, the only place I could find that kind of reference was in relation to the US Civil War, which was at the same sort of time. But he goes on to say that it wouldn't be a good thing if I was to tell people what a really good time I had at the asylum, otherwise they'd all want to be in there. But what is striking about his letter is in full in the book, but what is striking is it's the prejudice against him that comes across loud and clear in his letter. His own family are treating him differently. They won't let him sleep in his own bed. And potential employers, laugh at him when he says, oh yeah, I worked at the asylum. Oh yeah, off you go. So that's really sad, and it's the sort of thing we might expect to see and hear today. But that was in 1862. So that's Thomas Lawton. Yes, we're doing okay for time so far. Right, let's look at how people were treated. And this is medical treatment. Now, these are what I've called natural remedies. Now, there's a quiz where you're getting a free quiz with this talk. Can you spot on that list deadly nightshade, foxglove and poppy? Yeah, so we've got belladonna, digitalis and opium. And the strange thing is, of course, you can see on that list, third one down, cannabis indica. Was it only last year that cannabis oil was legalized for medical use? Well, they were using cannabis back in the 19th century. Most of us will have senna in our medicine cabinet as well. So there are things on there that you'd recognize. I can never say this word, chemical preparations. Again, we've got some, can you spot smelling salts, baking soda and Epsom salts on that list? There are ammonium carbonate, sodium hydrogen carbonate and magnesium sulfate. The zinc oxide down on the right-hand side, if you look at the active ingredients in a tube of germaline, you'll find zinc oxide in there. I love that smell of germaline, it's lovely, isn't it? But the point I'm making here is there were no clever drugs. Yes, there was opium, which was then used in laudanum, but there were no clever drugs. They were much later in the 19th century before they started to emerge, and in fact the vast majority of them during the 20th century. But the thing they made a lot of use of were, I've called it therapies. On the left-hand side there you can see a list: bleeding, blistering, making patients vomit, and making them go to the toilet. Now, this was actually based on some suggestions from a chap called Hippocrates back in, it's about 600 BC, wasn't it? So as long ago as that, what the belief was that your physical and mental state was a reflection of the balance of humors in your body. So those humors were, bile, there was black bile, a different bile, there was phlegm, and blood, of course. And so the idea was that you would treat people by actually trying to balance these humors. It all sounds a bit hit and miss to me, but they actually believed in this and were still using this well into the 19th century. In fact, leeches, medical leeches, are still in use today. I'm afraid I wasn't able to bring my collection with me, so you can all relax. But the bleeding is the one that usually catches the imagination, and it would be done with leeches, or literally arteriotomy would mean cutting an artery. And you see this happening in some extraordinary situations, like a pregnant woman. But the leeches were their favorites. And the idea was to put the leeches where the problem was. Yeah? So that was the idea. So Susanna Breer from Ovenden, she was 3 months pregnant and she was being treated with bleeding, purging and leeches. And this is before she came into the asylum. But the physician who had referred her said, depletion general and local, purgatives with antimony. She's pregnant, it's a heavy metal, but they didn't know it. Purgatives with antimony, with a good effect for a time at least. Leeches have been applied to the labia and anus with decided benefit. George Copley from Lofthouse. Now, George, this is one for the gentleman. George was struggling. He had a condition. He had a hydrocele in his scrotum. Now, hydrocele, that's why it's one for the gentleman, by the way. A hydrocele is a fluid-filled cyst, which can give pain. And they wanted, his was causing a problem for him. So the physician ordered that he have a suspensory bandage and soap plaster applied. But then, if that wasn't working, a week later he said, the tumour has a little increased. If pain should increase, apply 8 or 10 leeches. What I was surprised to find was, in March, it says, hydrocele pretty much in status quo, punctured freely with a needle. So they were drawing fluid off with a needle. But then it actually changes the use of the terminology. Hydrocele very full, acupuncture. Right? So the drawing off of they're calling it acupuncture. So if somebody offers you acupuncture in future, for whatever, just question it. So that was, so in terms of therapies, they were very fond of water, hydrotherapy. In fact, in the 1870s, the asylum actually commissioned, and the patients built it, a Turkish baths in the asylum. It looked great. It looks like a spa, because the floor plan is still in the records. But there are other things that they were using as therapies. Electrification, that's galvanism. Now, can you remember back at school when you used to that handle and you make people's hair stand up? This was what was happening. So this was mechanically generated electricity, and it was to give the patients a shock. Mary Frances Heaton from Doncaster. This was 1839. Now her humours were out of balance because what they recognised with the fact she hadn't had a period for 6 years. So the physicians thought, well, we'll sort it, we'll get her back into balance. So catamenia have been entirely suppressed for 6 years past. General health good with only 2 exceptions. Electric shocks to be passed through the pelvis every second day. That's galvanism for you. It goes on to say, this is later, has remained in the same state of mind, at times violent and very abusive to those around her. She, she has this day violently assaulted the nurse and given her a black eye without any provocation. She has at various times struck several of the patients, giving them black eyes and other injuries. No wonder. But no, she's another character. Let's. We talked about. This is called the circular swing. Now, it's either this one where the patient sits or the patient lies down. So it's not all one thing. But the idea was that this chap here is pushing this rod and causing the unit to spin at high speed. I think I can relate it to the waltzers gone wrong. You know, the candy floss everywhere. And the whole purpose of it was to actually cause the patients to be sick. It was used in the 1820s, but then you find it being less that it's being used, and I actually found at least one instance where it was used with a patient who was refusing to go out to work in the gardens, and the physician actually said, well, if you're not up to going out, I think we'll need to put you in the circular swing. And you can imagine the patient very quickly picking up his spade and getting on with it. So it was being used as coercion as much as anything. Now then, the shower bath. When I first read about the shower bath, I thought it was going to be great. You know, lots of glass, bit of chrome, you know, lovely, able to control the temperature. No, it was nothing like that. The shower bath, I did actually find a description of the shower bath. And it is described as a wooden box, 19 inches square, 8 feet 3 inches high, having a solid wooden door without aperture of any kind. The perforated plate admitting the shower is pierced with holes, and this is cold water. The shower is pierced with holes about and so arranged that the water descending at a rate varying from 19.5 to 39 gallons per minute. That's a lot of water. It completely envelops the patient, fills the center of the box, and thus expels the atmospheric air. Can you imagine? That must have been pretty horrific. It's one lady, Elizabeth Coulson, she was admitted in 1821. She'd been in the shower bath. This is May 1821. Has been twice in the bath, which she dislikes exceedingly. On going yesterday, she wept very much and promised the nurse to talk and be more cheerful if it might be omitted. It was, upon these conditions, but as it turned out, it didn't actually change her. However, later on, April 1822, has been galvanized 3 or 4 times. She has spoken several times since. Says she thinks it has done her good. Pardon me, and that she felt afterwards more power to speak. So that's the patient saying, actually, this is a good thing. So we can't make judgments that say that's barbaric, because actually in her case, it worked. Now then, in terms of water, there's a chap that I came across, his name is William Winter. William had been suffering from constipation, really suffering, and they'd been treating him with rhubarb. But he was actually, in this instance, they were trying to relax him with a warm bath. Let's just see. Yeah, now nobody's going to be able to read that, I don't think. But if I do that, you should be able to read it now. Now, if anybody's in any doubt, 4 feet 5 inches. Now, when I found that record, I went to the chap who was in the archives handing the stuff out. I was like, "Can you have a look at this and just tell me that I'm seeing this correctly?" Because what you're seeing here, see these 3 exclamation marks. And this is witnessed by William Ellis, who was the top man. He was the superintendent in the asylum. and a clerk, and also an attendant, who in those days they called them keepers. So William, I think they had an eye on the Guinness Book of Records with that. So anyway, the warm bath did help, and a couple of days later he repeated but he didn't break his own record. But forgive me, in my book I could not resist it when I talk about William Winter, and I think I've said, I hope this was accompanied by an equally long sigh of relief from William. Right, mechanical restraints, something else that gets a bad press. They were largely phased out in the county asylums by the 1850s. But before that, they were in use. This is from an 1888 catalogue, and I've got no reason to believe they'd be any different if we saw them. They'd be much the same sort of thing. So straitjackets, muffs, etc. If you were in the workhouse or the prison, they would still use them, but not in the asylums. Again, our perception is a bad thing, but this lady, Sarah Asquith, she actually was an epileptic, and she knew when a fit was coming on. She could tell, she could feel it, and she would ask to be put in her chair. She would actually ask to be restrained because she felt then more comfortable and in a better place altogether. So again, it's not all negative. Another form of treatment, common sense. Sarah Riley was, that's not Sarah, by the way, she was a young woman who was admitted to the asylum in 1838. That's Queen Victoria, who came to the throne just at that time. And not surprisingly, a lot of young women across the country believed they were actually Queen Victoria. So how do you treat that? You've got a delusion. She's clearly delusional. And what they did was that the case note says, when first admitted, fancied herself the Queen Victoria, but being placed in the same room with another girl who also believed herself the same personage, she reasoned with her and thought it was impossible there would be two Queen Victorias. But the loveliest thing is, and you see this a lot in the records, the physicians, I think they've got quite a good sense of humour. Because it's what it says, is she resigned her pretensions to the throne in favour of her companion with the full conviction that they must both be wrong. So that was Sarah Riley. That's common sense, I think. Now in this book, which I have here, this is the only book that's been written about the Wakefield Asylum by John Todd and Lawrence Ashworth, who were both working in the NHS. But I came across a paragraph in here. They're talking about the artistic abilities of some of the patients, and they make a specific reference to this eagle lectern, which was carved by a patient. They didn't know who it was, and I thought, that's interesting. That's very interesting. So park it away until another day. And then I came across the case notes for one Lachlan Mackenzie. He was Scottish from Glasgow, and he'd come down to work in Huddersfield. And he was a wood turner. And he'd been behaving oddly, and then he started having fits, and it was decided for his safety that he should be admitted to the asylum. All very well so far. But then his case notes tell us that amongst other work, he carved, among other work, he carved an eagle lectern for the church. So all of a sudden we now know who carved the eagle lectern. But the best bit about the eagle lectern is you can actually still go and see it at the Mental Health Museum in Fieldhead in Wakefield. It's still there. And I have no idea why they call him Elvis. We've just got time for another couple of extraordinary patients. James Walker was admitted from Leeds. He was admitted in 1861, I think it was. And he very quickly demonstrated a talent as a draftsman. He was good at drawing. And the then head of the asylum, John Clayton, asked him if he would do an up-to-date drawing of the asylum. Because since Landseer's one in 1818, there hadn't been one done. And it had changed dramatically in that time. So he set James Walker the task of coming up with a new drawing. This, again, is in the museum in Field Head. But look at the detail on there. It's extraordinary. And he wasn't using a hot air balloon. There were no helicopters. He was doing that because he was able to imagine he was actually above this site, because it's a bird's eye view from about several hundred feet above. I'd one audience member one time said he probably climbed a tree. And I said, no, you've got that wrong. It's only the rhubarb that grows that high in Wakefield. But that kind of skill from James Walker is the sort of thing that I've only ever seen something similar once. Television program, a young man who was able to look at the skyline of London and go away and reproduce it in detail. And he was autistic. Yeah. We might have to end on Joseph Hoyle. I did say that there are real nuggets when you find something that's been written by the patients themselves. But Joseph Hoyle, what's unusual about what he wrote is it found its way into the Halifax Courier. He had written a love letter to his wife, who was a patient in the lunatic ward of the Halifax workhouse. And the following year, the paper published it. They didn't actually name him, but they actually quoted his letter in full. And if we ever needed a reminder that these were real individuals, let me just share with you a couple of lines from where is it? He writes to his wife Mary and says, "Oh, would I were a bird that I might fly to thee, to breathe one loving word to one so dear to me." And he says, "No two persons ever lived more agreeably together in holy matrimony than you and I. We were Siamese twins in moral affections. Our hearts were interwoven with each other. Like other people, we had our ups and downs in the world. We had our trials and difficulties to contend with. But your amiable goodness, your tender feminine softness, that endearing sweetness of disposition, with all the charming offspring of a warm feeling heart, ever made me cheerful when I was at home with you." It's wonderful. We'll click through. 5 minutes? Is that? Yeah. Very quickly, Anne Fothergill. I think that photograph redefines the word glum. She's miserable because her father has been the root cause of her depression. But he goes to visit her, Anne, in hospital, and discovers that she's not in a great place, particularly her language, because she's associating with other individuals coming from all sorts of walks of life. And he writes to the superintendent, and his letter survives in the case notes. And what he says in there is that her language is the language of the brothel. What's going through your minds is, how did he know? Right, William Roberts. Amiable rogue, William Roberts. It was very clear when William was admitted that he was rather fond of his drink. And the case notes actually say that he was able to get more than was good for him, which probably means he was coming to some arrangement, because there was beer in the asylum, and he was getting other people's beer. But they clearly liked him, because on this occasion, he's actually taken out by an assistant medical officer and a clinical clerk, two of the officers of the asylum, and he's taken on a day's fishing, which is lovely. And they clearly take a picnic, and they go in a dog cart. And I thought, whoa, how big a dog do you need to drag one of those? But of course, a dog cart is like that. It's called a dog cart because between the driver, and the chap sitting at the back, there's a box. And that is where you might put your dogs, or it's where you would put your fishing gear and your picnic. Okay? So anyway, they took him off in this dog cart, and you've got to imagine the scene when they get back to the asylum. Because what's happened is William has had a really good picnic, and he's fallen off the back of the cart, and they only know when they get back to the gates of the asylum. And what I love is the last line there. Eventually he was landed safely at home. They've gone back and found him still asleep on the road, haven't they? But eventually he was landed safely at home, because they'd been on a fishing trip. I'm going to end it there. I hope you've enjoyed that as much as I have, and thank you for your attention.
David, thank you very much indeed for that. I mean, it was a serious subject, but it was treated in such a lovely way that I think it's made us all aware of really what the conditions were. But then, as you said, they were real people. I think we haven't really got any time for questions if we were going to finish on time. However, David is in the guild, and I'm sure that if you wanted to ask him anything, he wouldn't mind you emailing him. Okay? So I think that's the answer, to do that, so that we do finish on time. Just a couple of things before we go. It has been really nice to see you all. I hope you've had a really good day. Please tell us all about it in your feedback sheets that you're going to leave with your lanyards out at the back there. There is a little bit of food. If anybody wants some for a long journey home, there's some foil and film and things that you can wrap something up if you'd like to. Please take what you want. We really don't want to lose it. We have got about 4 bags of waste in bags, which we would be most grateful. 2 of them I think are just rubbish that will go, 2 or 3, somebody will tell you, that will just be put in a bin. There is one with compostable stuff in. The ladies have been carefully sorting it all out, so there is one of those. And anyway, they would tell you, so if you could possibly take one of those so that you can dump it wherever it needs to go, we would be very grateful. So it just remains now to wish you all a very safe journey home. Hopefully we'll see you at our next one, which is in Selby in August, different part of the country. Why not? Have a good day. Bye.